When the farmer went out to harvest his crop, he had no idea that something hidden beneath the soil would force him to risk everything he had. From that moment on, his quiet life turned into a battle against people, nature, and circumstances he couldn't tell anyone about. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're watching from. Would you be able to keep a secret like this? The morning unfolded slowly over the quiet stretch of rural Georgia, casting long, pale beams across the fields that stretched behind Michael's farmhouse. The air was still heavy with moisture from the night's thunderstorms, the kind that rattled windows and left a sharp, metallic smell lingering in the air for hours afterward. The ground was dark, soft and steaming, gently under the first touch of sunlight. Birds were already awake, moving through the tall pines that bordered the land like silent sentinels, their calls echoing through the thin morning fog. Michael stood on the wooden front porch of his house, a chipped ceramic mug warming his hands, his eyes tracing the outline of his property, as if taking silent inventory of every corner. He did this most mornings, but today felt different for reasons he couldn't yet name. It might have been the storm, or the thick, humid air, or simply the weight of another long day of harvest ahead. His clothes already smelled faintly of earth washed 100 times, but the scent of soil never really left denim here. He drained the last sip of coffee, set the mug down on the porch railing, and stepped toward the fields. The walk to the potato rows took him past the old barn, a structure so weather-beaten it looked like it belonged to a different century. The doors creaked softly as the breeze moved through them. Inside, tools hung on nails hammered in long ago, some by Michael's father, others by his grandfather. This farm was not just a place to work, it was a living timeline of his family's history. Generations had walked these rows, planted in this same soil, watched the sky for the same storms. Michael felt all of that history on his shoulders each morning, but it was a weight he carried willingly. Farming was not a job to him. It was an inheritance, a responsibility. He reached the potato field, boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. The storm had been intense, and the soil was looser than usual. He started with his motoblock, hoping it would save time, but after a few attempts, the machine sputtered, whined, and jerked unpredictably as its wheels caught in the mud. He cursed under his breath, wiped sweat and moisture off his forehead, and gave the machine one last hopeful tug. The motoblock shook violently, then stalled entirely, leaving only an irritated buzzing in the air. Michael sighed. He shouldn't have expected anything else. The old machine had been unreliable for years. The storm had soaked the ground more than he realized. There was no way to use heavy machinery today. He set the motoblock aside and reached for his shovel, its wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. Manual labor wasn't what he wanted today, but it was what he had. He stepped between the rows, feeling the earth shift under his weight, and dug the shovel deep into the softened soil. The scent of wet dirt rose immediately, rich and deep, filling the air with that familiar promise of harvest. He worked steadily, creating small mounds as potatoes surfaced like buried treasure beneath the earth. Sweat formed quickly on his brow, trickling down the side of his face. The sun was rising, the heat building faster than he expected. After nearly an hour of work, he grew accustomed to the rhythm of digging, lifting, tossing. The earth responded predictably until it didn't. When his shovel drove into the next patch of soil, he heard a sound that made him stop instantly. It wasn't the crisp crack of hitting a potato, nor the dull scrape of striking a root or stone. It was something else, something soft and hollow, almost like tapping against a thick shell. Michael froze, his hand still gripping the shovel's handle. He slowly lowered himself to one knee, brushed aside some of the soil with his glove, and peered closer. At first he thought he was imagining the shape he saw emerging, a pale, smooth curve beneath the dirt. He brushed away more, then more still. A subtle oval form took shape beneath the surface, its texture too uniform to be a stone or a rotten potato. He sat back on his heels, heart beating a little faster. Snakes. The word flashed through his mind instantly. These fields sometimes attracted them, especially after heavy rains. Garter snakes, king snakes, and on rarer occasions, rattlesnakes. He had seen enough of them in his lifetime to respect their presence. A nest of snake eggs was not something he wanted near his crops, his dogs, or God forbid his nieces when they visited and ran barefoot across the fields like wild spirits. He leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. The egg was bigger than he expected, longer, smoother, almost glossy. Carefully, he brushed away more dirt around it. As the soil parted, he realized it wasn't just one egg. There were several, nestled together in a shallow depression of earth. The arrangement was tidy, deliberate, not scattered, not chaotic. They had been placed here with purpose. Michael felt a tightening in his chest. Snakes usually hid their eggs under logs or in cool nooks, not in the middle of a worked potato field. He lifted his head and scanned the surroundings, searching for any sign of movement shadows in the grass, the flick of a tail, the shimmer of scales in the morning light. Nothing. Only silence, broken by the chirping of birds and the distant hum of insects waking up. He swallowed and forced himself to breathe evenly. He had to think. He had to be careful. He reached out one gloved hand and gently touched the surface of the nearest egg. It gave slightly under pressure, not fragile, not overly firm, something in between. He pulled his hand back immediately. He didn't want to damage anything, whatever it was. He crouched, elbows resting on his knees, and stared at the cluster for several long moments. It didn't make sense. They looked like snake eggs, but they didn't. The size was wrong. The shape was slightly wrong. The placement was unusual. He frowned, trying to recall whether he'd ever seen anything similar before. He took a deep breath and stood. He needed a better look at their arrangement, without disturbing them too much. Kneeling again, he slowly scraped away the dirt from around the edges, revealing a wider portion of the clutch. At least 6 eggs, maybe 7, all identical, all aligned neatly in a shallow bowl-shaped nest. He felt the first prickle of unease creeping up his spine. If this was a snake nest, especially a rattler's, it would mean the mother might not be far. But rattlesnakes rarely laid eggs like this. The puzzle made him uneasy. He stood and wiped his forehead with the back of his arm. His heart was beating faster now, not from exertion, but from uncertainty. The morning sunlight seemed harsher all of a sudden, the quiet field too exposed. Something was off. He could feel it. Michael began to search the surrounding area more carefully. He stepped lightly, eyes trained on the ground. He checked between the rows, scanned the grass beyond the field, and even looked up toward the trees at the edge of his property. Nothing. No sign of a snake or any other animal that might have laid these eggs. His thoughts raced. Could the storm have driven an animal out of its usual nesting ground? Had something uncommon moved through during the night? Or was this something stranger, something rare, something he hadn't seen before in all his years working this land? He crouched again beside the nest, studying it closely. He brushed his thumb over the dirt surrounding the clutch, noticing how the soil had been shaped, almost as if carefully molded. That was unusual. Most wild animals weren't precise. Snakes in particular were messy nesters. He leaned closer still, inspecting the tiny patterns in the earth, the faint traces of movement. His curiosity sharpened. Something about the nest felt old and intentional, not hastily thrown together. It didn't look like the casual nesting choice of a passing creature. He stayed there a long time, the sun rising higher over his back, his thoughts circling like vultures around a mystery. The eggs remained silent, unmoving, pale against the rich, dark soil. He tried to imagine what creature had placed them there, what instincts had guided it, what circumstances had brought it to select this particular patch of earth. Eventually he rose, brushing dust from his knees. He walked slowly back toward the house, pausing several times to glance over his shoulder, as if afraid the eggs might disappear or shift when he wasn't looking. Something inside him told him that what he had found was important, that it was the beginning of something far larger than a morning harvest. He walked the last stretch in silence, the cool of the morning fading quickly under the Georgia sun. When he reached the porch, he paused, gripping the railing. His thoughts were full, heavy, unsettled. He looked back toward the field one last time before stepping inside, feeling as though he had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see, something nature had meant to keep hidden. And though he couldn't yet say why, one thing was clear. This discovery was not going to leave him alone. Michael stepped into the house with a heaviness that wasn't caused by physical work alone. Even after closing the wooden screen door behind him, He felt as though the strange cluster of eggs remained lodged in his thoughts, following him like an unfinished sentence. The kitchen greeted him with a dim, warm, quiet sunlight filtering weakly through the gingham curtains his mother had sewn years ago. The room still held traces of her presence, something that always lingered here. Jars labeled with her neat handwriting, a faded chart of native Georgia flora pinned to the wall, and a stack of old wildlife magazines she used to read over breakfast. He had never given them much thought. Now he felt drawn to them in a way he couldn't explain. He washed his hands at the sink, watching the mud swirl off his fingers and settle into thin brown lines that snaked toward the drain. The water was warm, but he felt a cold tension beneath his skin that the heat could not chase away. When he dried his hands and sat down at the kitchen table, he did not reach for food, though he had skipped breakfast. Instead, he pulled his laptop from the counter and placed it in front of him, the device looking oddly out of place on the old wooden surface. Technology rarely found a home in this kitchen. It belonged to simpler rituals. But today, the kitchen was no place for comfort. It was a place for searching. He opened the laptop and, after a moment, began typing, "Snake eggs, Georgia field identification." The search results appeared quickly, columns of images, articles, nature blogs. He clicked through several photos, comparing the shapes, colors, sizes. Most snake eggs in Georgia were smaller, more leathery in appearance, sometimes uneven. He scrolled. None of them matched the image still fresh in his memory. The eggs he had found were large, smooth, almost polished-looking beneath the dirt. Snake eggs, the websites told him, often clustered tightly, but never arranged with that strange, purposeful symmetry he had witnessed. His breathing slowed as he studied more images. The tension in his shoulders didn't ease. It grew sharper. He clicked another link, another collection of reptile eggs in the southeastern United States. Again, the shape was close, but not close enough. The color was off. The size was wrong. Every inconsistency deepened the uneasy suspicion forming inside him. Whatever he had found was not a snake's nest. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed the bridge of his nose with his fingers. For a moment he considered dismissing the discovery as some unusual but harmless natural event, an oddity, nothing more. But something inside him resisted. Instinct, perhaps, or maybe a farmer's habit of reading the land, noticing when something felt unnatural, out of place. He looked toward the corner of the kitchen where his mother's old bookshelf stood. The worn spines of her field guides leaned toward one another like tired shoulders. He got up, walked over, and ran his hand along the familiar titles. Birds of the Southeast, Amphibians of Georgia, Native Reptiles and Their Habitats. He pulled the last one out. The book fell open in his hands like it remembered the exact place he needed. He carried it back to the table, flipping through pages filled with sketches, photographs, and diagrams his mother once studied with such fascination. He paused at a section showing reptiles that nested in the state. There were diagrams of various eggs, their sizes compared in neat silhouettes. Then his breath caught slightly when he saw an image on the right-hand page oval, smooth, pale eggs, nearly identical in size to the ones buried in his field. They were labeled simply gopher tortoise, Gopherus polyphemus, threatened species. He stared at the caption for several seconds. The words didn't immediately sink in. He read them again, slower this time. Threatened species, gopher tortoise, eggs typically laid in dry, sandy soil near open fields, protected under both state and federal law. He felt his pulse accelerate, thudding heavily in his chest. He flipped to the next page. There in bold letters was a section outlining legal protections. Destruction of gopher tortoise habitats or nests can result in significant fines, up to $10,000 for a single incident. Habitat disturbance could lead to property restrictions. Nest removal strictly prohibited. Michael leaned back in his chair as if something had physically struck him. The kitchen seemed suddenly smaller, the walls closer. He closed the book, then opened it again, rereading details he wished belonged to some other species, some common, unremarkable creature, not one that triggered federal oversight and legal consequences. He was a farmer, not a biologist. He wasn't equipped for this kind of responsibility, nor was he prepared for the implications. He stood slowly and began pacing across the kitchen floor. The eggs in the field weren't merely odd, they were a liability, a legal landmine, a threat to his livelihood if mishandled. He could not dig near them. He could not move them. He could not let them be destroyed. And worst of all, he could not involve authorities without risking his entire farm being designated as protected land, which would strip him of control over where he could plow, plant, or construct anything for years. The government was not forgiving once a species was deemed protected on someone's property. He ran one hand down the side of his face, stopping to press his thumb into the corner of his jaw. He felt the weight of countless decisions that suddenly needed to be made. He thought of the neighbor who had once unknowingly destroyed a similar nest and found himself entangled in months of legal procedures, fines, and forced land surveys. The poor man had nearly lost his home, all because of a few eggs hidden beneath the soil. Michael returned to the table and stared at the open laptop, not moving for several long moments. The eggs in the field seemed to press into his thoughts more insistently now, as if demanding action. He imagined them beneath the earth, silent, vulnerable, and protected by laws far more powerful than he had ever expected to face. He closed the laptop with a quiet thud and exhaled a shaky breath. He knew he had to act. Leaving the eggs exposed would invite disaster. One misplaced step, a wandering animal, or a curious neighbor could ruin everything, and he certainly could not allow any state inspector to stumble upon the nest. That would change the course of his life and his farm permanently. He went outside again, the bright daylight almost startling after the dim comfort of the kitchen. He crossed the yard with long strides, the tension in his body pushing him forward. When he reached the potato field once more, he approached the nest slowly, as though stepping into sacred ground. The pale ovals sat silently in their little hollow, unaware of the turmoil they had caused. He crouched beside them, resting his hands on his knees. His mind spun through possibilities. How does one protect something that cannot be moved? Something fragile yet surrounded by harsh realities, animals, weather, people? He studied the nest, imagining what risks lay ahead. Storms washing away the soil, birds scavenging, curious neighbors poking around where they didn't belong, or even his own tractor wheels crushing everything unknowingly. He stood up and started walking the perimeter of the area, noting the dips and slopes in the land. The nest was in a vulnerable spot, sitting slightly lower than the surrounding rows. If heavy rain came again, water could pool there. If livestock got loose, they could wander right through. If someone walked by, they could trip over it without even seeing what they had done. Michael decided then and there that he had to build a barrier. Something subtle, something that wouldn't attract attention, but would keep creatures and people away. He walked back toward the barn, almost on autopilot, gathering weathered wooden stakes, some old rope, and a roll of faded construction ribbon left over from a long-ago project. His movements were purposeful, decisive. Fear had turned into resolve. He returned to the field and began placing the stakes in a rough square around the nest, each one driven quietly into the damp earth. He tied the rope between them, then added the ribbon loosely along the perimeter. It looked makeshift, unremarkable, as if he were marking off a patch of unstable soil or a minor repair area. To anyone else, it would appear routine, but to him it was a shield. When he finished, he stood back to examine his work. It wasn't much, but it was something, a beginning. He took one last look at the eggs before turning away, feeling a strange sense of responsibility settle in his chest. He wasn't sure what the next few days would bring. He only knew that whatever happened, he had to protect that nest. Not because the law required it, but because something in him, something inherited from the generations who had tended this land, said it was the right thing to do. And so he walked back toward the house, the sun rising higher behind him, carrying the weight of a promise he had never expected to make. The next morning rose gray and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed down on the fields with a muted, expectant stillness. Michael stepped outside with a quiet tension coiled in his chest, the memory of yesterday's discovery stubbornly lingering. He walked toward the potato field, not with the casual rhythm of routine, but with the steady, deliberate pace of someone approaching a responsibility he never asked for, yet could not ignore. The makeshift barrier he had erected stood exactly where he had left it, the faded construction ribbon fluttering lazily in the slight morning breeze. It looked unremarkable from a distance, almost pitifully ordinary, but to him it had become a symbol of a fragile secret he now carried alone. He crouched beside the rope line and scanned the perimeter carefully, searching the soil for disturbances. No footprints he didn't recognize. No animal tracks crossing through the ribbon. No signs of rain pooling near the nest overnight. For a moment, relief eased the tightness in his shoulders. The eggs remained untouched, sheltered in their shallow cradle beneath the loose soil. He stood again, exhaling slowly, and for a brief instant the morning felt manageable. But the illusion didn't last long. As he turned to leave the field, he caught a movement from the corner of his eye. A figure standing near the fence line, stocky, broad-shouldered, leaning on one boot as if he'd been watching for a while. Michael stopped, the tension instantly returning. There, only a dozen yards away, stood his neighbor, Douglas Tanner, arms folded tightly across his chest and eyes fixed directly on the enclosed patch of ground. Douglas was the type of man whose presence carried weight even before he spoke. His face was weathered from decades working under the southern sun, carved with deep lines that suggested permanent irritation. He wore his usual uniform, scuffed work boots, worn jeans, and a flannel shirt that never seemed to fit quite right over his broad torso. His brow furrowed as he leaned forward slightly, squinting at the odd structure Michael had created the day before. It was the look of a man who did not like not knowing things, especially when they happened on land he could see from his porch. "Morning," Michael said cautiously, though the word threatened to catch in his throat. He stepped away from the barrier, trying to appear as casual as possible as he wiped his palms on his jeans, hoping that Douglas did not notice how stiffly he moved. Douglas didn't answer right away. He shifted his weight, spat into the grass, and let a moment of pointed silence hang between them before speaking. "You fixing something out here?" he finally asked, his voice rough and edged with suspicion. He tipped his chin toward the stakes and ribbon. "Looks like you're digging up half your field." Michael swallowed, sensing that any wrong word could turn Douglas's curiosity into something more dangerous. He forced a short laugh that felt unnatural in his throat. "Just dealing with a soft patch after the storm," he said. "Didn't want to twist an ankle or run the tractor over a dip I haven't filled yet." Douglas grunted, but his eyes didn't leave the makeshift enclosure. He stepped closer to the fence, and Michael's heartbeat quickened. "Don't remember that ground being soft last season," Douglas muttered. "Storm wasn't even that bad." "It was enough to make a mess of this section," Michael lied, keeping his tone easy, neutral. "Just took the chance to mark it off." Douglas stared long and hard at the area, his jaw working slowly as though chewing over something invisible. Michael felt a chill creep up his spine despite the thick humidity. If there was anyone capable of making trouble where none existed, it was Douglas Tanner. The man had a talent for sensing anything unusual and twisting it into something worth gossiping about or complaining about to the county, if it suited him. "You dig up anything?" Douglas asked suddenly. The question hit hard, too close, too direct. Michael wasn't prepared for it. He blinked and forced steady breath into his lungs. "Just mud and rock," he answered. "Why?" Douglas shrugged, though the gesture didn't match the sharpness in his gaze. "Storms turn up all kinds of things, sometimes something worth finding." He looked at Michael with a spark of something unsettling, a mix of curiosity and rivalry that had simmered between them for years. "Wouldn't want you hiding anything valuable from the rest of us." Michael smiled, but it wasn't genuine. "Nothing valuable in the dirt except potatoes," he said. For a moment, Douglas said nothing. Then, with another low grunt, he turned and walked along the fence, but not away, just slowly, deliberately, circling the property line as though memorizing every detail. Michael followed his movement with careful eyes, trying to assess whether the neighbor had accepted the explanation or whether his suspicion had just begun to sharpen. The lingering glance Douglas cast over his shoulder suggested the latter. The rest of the morning unfolded under a haze of unease. As Michael worked through the field checking irrigation lines, clearing branches blown down by the storm, tending to the soil, he couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Several times he caught glimpses of Douglas moving between the trees bordering his property or lingering near the edge of the pasture as if waiting for something out of place to reveal itself. Each glimpse tightened the knot in his stomach. By late afternoon, Michael decided to reinforce the ruse. He retrieved old planks from the barn, leaning them against the stakes around the nest, giving the barrier the unmistakable look of an area under routine maintenance. He kicked some loose soil around, disturbed the ground just enough to make it appear as though he truly had been working there. He hoped the appearance of normalcy, mundane, boring normalcy, would be enough to deter Douglas. He was wrong. That night, long after the orange glow of sunset faded and the cicadas began their endless droning in the darkness, Michael stepped out onto his porch to take in the stillness of the farm. The air was thick and warm, carrying the faint scent of honeysuckle and recently churned earth. He stood there for a few minutes, letting his eyes adjust to the dark, thinking about little more than whether he should finally go inside and sleep. But then he noticed a small flicker of light far out in the field, bobbing gently in the shadows. A flashlight. He froze, gripping the porch railing as if anchoring himself to something solid. The beam of light moved slowly along the fence line, dipping down, rising again, pausing occasionally. Then it drifted closer to the very corner of the yard where the potato rows began. Michael's breath caught. He didn't need to guess who it was. Without thinking, he stepped off the porch and started toward the field, the grass whispering under his boots. Each step quickened with a growing mixture of anger and anxiety. The nearer he got, the clearer the silhouette became. Tall, broad, unmistakably Douglas, leaning in toward the barrier, inspecting it closely with his flashlight trained directly on the stakes and ribbon. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Michael called out sharply, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. Douglas straightened instantly, the light from his flashlight jerking upward. For a split second, the beam shone across Michael's face, forcing him to raise a hand. Then Douglas lowered it slightly but didn't step back from the barrier. "Just taking a look," Douglas said, as if the explanation were obvious enough to excuse wandering onto someone else's property in the middle of the night. "Saw your lights earlier. Thought maybe you were working out here after dark." Michael stepped closer. "It's my land, not a public trail. You can't go wandering around in the middle of the night." Douglas scoffed. "Storm knocked out part of my fence earlier. Figured maybe a cow wandered through here. Thought I saw something odd from my porch." His eyes drifted again toward the ground inside the barrier, and Michael's pulse spiked. "There's nothing here for you to see," Michael said firmly, now standing between Douglas and the stakes. "I told you earlier, it's just a soft patch, and I really don't appreciate you poking around like this." Douglas frowned, not buying the hostility as a simple overreaction. He stepped back finally, though not far enough to ease the tension. "You're acting awful protective of a little mud hole," he muttered. "I'd say that makes a man more suspicious, not less." Michael clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to lash back. He had to stay composed. "Stay off my property," he said through steady breath. "Next time you walk through my fields at night, we'll have a bigger problem than a broken fence between us." Douglas stared at him for several seconds, the position of his jaw tense, the flashlight hanging loosely at his side, like a silent threat. Then he gave a short, humorless laugh. "Whatever you say, Michael." He turned and walked off, the light bobbing away into the darkness. Michael waited until the glow faded completely before he let himself breathe again. His hands trembled slightly as he stepped inside the rope barrier to check the nest. The eggs were untouched, still tucked safely in the earth, but the encounter left him shaken. He saw now how fragile his secret was. One curious neighbor, one poorly timed visit, one slipped lie could expose everything he was trying to protect. And Douglas Tanner was not the kind of man to let a mystery go unanswered. Standing in the dim moonlight, the warm night air pressing around him, Michael understood with chilling clarity that his troubles had only just begun. The secret he had hoped to guard quietly was already stirring interest, and if he wasn't careful, it would soon draw more attention than he could afford to handle. The next few days settled over the farm with an uneasy quiet, one that felt stretched thin by the tension between the two neighboring properties. Every morning when Michael stepped out onto his porch, he found himself scanning the horizon out of habit, searching for any sign of movement near the fence line or among the rows of crops. He didn't admit it out loud, not even to himself, but he could feel the invisible weight of Douglas's suspicions lingering like humidity in the air. The confrontation beneath the moonlight had changed things. Whatever fragile boundary had once existed between them, the unspoken respect that neighbors were supposed to have had cracked. It wasn't broken completely, not yet, but it had splintered enough to warn Michael that one wrong step might shatter it entirely. He walked out to the potato field with that thought clinging to him, and for a few minutes he simply stood at the edge of the rows, listening. The morning was heavy and dense, the air thick with the smell of wet leaves and rich soil, a scent that always followed the rainy seasons in this part of Georgia. Although the sky held a bright, open blue, the air pressed down as if preparing the land for something unwelcome, the strange omen of a storm that had not yet arrived. He reached the makeshift enclosure he had built around the nest and dropped into a kneel, brushing his fingers through the damp soil. The eggs were intact. They hadn't shifted or been disturbed, which eased his nerves for a moment. But then he noticed something else water-trapped in the shallow depression surrounding the stakes, a thin sheen glistening like pooled glass. The ground felt differently here, slightly softer, almost spongy beneath his touch. It wasn't just the morning dew, it was something heavier. He rose slowly, studying the slope of the field as it stretched out before him. He had grown up on this land, had known the way it drained rainwater almost instinctively. But now, after days of storms and after clearing the rows himself, he could see things others would miss. The dip in the soil near the nest was deeper than it used to be. The earth had shifted from the repeated moisture, forming an unintentional funnel that directed water toward the eggs. It was subtle, just an inch or two of elevation difference, but it was enough to spell disaster if a real storm came. He pressed his lips together, concern prickling behind his eyes. He didn't need the forecast on the radio to tell him the obvious. The sky had been speaking for days in the heaviness of the air, in the strange quiet of the fields. Rain was coming again. And it would be worse. He turned and headed toward the barn, his boots thudding softly over the ground. For a moment he allowed himself to imagine telling someone, anyone about the nest, sharing the burden of responsibility. Maybe someone would know what to do. Maybe a conservationist, a wildlife expert, someone used to dealing with fragile, protected species. But each time the idea flickered in his mind, it was crushed instantly by a stronger thought. The moment he involved someone outside the farm, the fate of his land would no longer be his own. He gathered what supplies he thought might help: an old tarp, a few wooden boards, a tool belt, rope, metal stakes. It wasn't much, but he wasn't building a shelter designed to last years. He only needed something that could hold back the worst of the storm, something to protect the fragile nest for long enough that the eggs could remain safe in their shallow bed. As he made his way back toward the field, a faint rumble echoed through the sky, far off yet unmistakable. Thunder, soft and distant, but real. The horizon darkened slightly, the early sunlight dimming as if someone had drawn a curtain over the morning. He picked up his pace. The work began simply. He installed a few boards angled toward the slope of the field, redirecting runoff toward an old irrigation ditch a dozen yards away. Then he carved a narrow trench with a spade, using his weight to push the blade through the wet soil. Sweat dripped down his temples, even though the air felt humid rather than hot. His shirt clung to his back as he worked, each breath coming heavier than the last. Still, he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. He hammered in the stakes beside the nest and draped the tarp over them, fashioning a crude roof. The tarp wasn't meant to touch the eggs directly. He knew enough from his mother's old wildlife books to understand that airflow was crucial, but it would at least shield them from the force of rain. After tying down the edges with rope and weighing them with stones, he stepped back to inspect the structure. It looked pitifully makeshift, a child's fort built on tremulous ground, but it was all he could manage with what little time he had left. The thunder rolled again, louder this time. The sky overhead deepened into a haze of dull gray that spread slowly outward like ink in water. Wind whispered through the trees, carrying a cool scent of approaching rain. Michael felt an anxious spark ignite inside him. He wasn't ready, not yet. He walked around the enclosure again, double-checking every knot, pressing the tarp more firmly into place, smoothing the soil around the trench. A gust of wind rushed through the field, scattering loose earth across his boots. The tarp fluttered violently in response, and he hurried to tighten it before it ripped. He was still adjusting the structure when he heard a faint, distant noise that didn't belong to the storm. It was the unmistakable sound of animals moving heavy steps, rhythmic, uneven. Michael's stomach tensed instantly. He turned his head toward the pasture bordering his property, and there in the distance were several of Douglas's cows wandering idly along the fence line. The fence on Douglas's side had been in rough shape for months, its planks warped and its wires sagging. It took only one strong push from a cow to loosen the posts enough for the herd to wander through. And now, with the storm approaching, the animals were restless. One of them nudged at the drooping fence. Another followed. The wood creaked loudly. Michael felt dread spike through him. If they got through, if they wandered into his rows, nothing would stop them from trampling directly over the nest he had sworn to protect. He sprinted toward the fence, calling out sharply, waving his arms to startle the cows back. The animals lifted their heads, their ears flicking, their bodies shifting with slow, stubborn reluctance. He clapped his hands, shouting louder, stepping between them and the sagging section of fence. Slowly, grudgingly, they drifted away, but not far. They lingered in the pasture, circling back toward the fence every few minutes, as though testing its weakness. The storm clouds thickened overhead, and the first cold droplets of rain began to tap against his shoulders. He looked from the cows to the nest, then back again, feeling a new sense of panic crawl up his spine. He could handle the rain. He could handle the runoff. He could handle the tarp and the trench and the weight of responsibility he carried. But he could not handle everything at once. Not alone. He tightened his jaw and moved along the fence line, bracing the looser planks with extra boards he found stacked near the corner of his barn. He hammered them into place with quick, forceful strikes, the sound of metal against wood echoing across the pasture. The rain grew heavier, pattering against his back in cool sheets. By the time he returned to the nest, droplets had begun streaking down the tarp like silver veins. He knelt again beside the fragile clutch, checking once more for signs of disturbance. He pressed his palm against the soil, feeling the subtle vibrations of the rain as it began to seep into the ground. The earth trembled faintly beneath him, growing softer with each passing minute. He worked late into the night, the wind whipping the tarp around him, the rain battering the ground with relentless force. He reinforced the trench twice. He added extra stones to hold down the edges of the tarp. He checked the cows' movements periodically, and each time he saw them drifting near the fence, he felt another surge of fear that they might break through and undo everything he had fought so hard to protect. By the time the storm reached its peak, the sky was flashing with jagged bolts of lightning that illuminated the field in stark white bursts. Thunder crashed, shaking the ground so violently that even the trees seemed to shudder. Rain fell so heavily it blurred the edges of the world, turning the lines of the potato rows into murky streaks of mud and water. And still he stayed by the nest. He crouched there, soaked, cold, exhausted, watching the rain pound the tarp until it sagged dangerously low, tightening the rope each time a gust of wind threatened to rip it free. The mud clung to his boots in thick layers. His fingers stung from gripping the wooden stakes for support. But he didn't leave. He didn't even think of leaving. He had made himself the guardian of that fragile clutch, and the storm had become a test of his resolve. When the storm finally began to ease in the early hours of dawn, the air quieted into a soft drizzle. The sky lightened from pitch black to deep indigo, then to a muted gray. Michael stood with difficulty, stiff and trembling, and bent over the tarp one last time. It held. The eggs were safe beneath it. His breath shook with relief. He looked toward the horizon, watching the clouds drift slowly away, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt sacred. Water pooled in the trenches he had carved, but none reached the nest. The fence held. The cows had retreated far from the border. The tarp, tattered and stretched but intact, had protected the fragile life beneath it. He wiped the rain from his face and let out a long, uneven breath. He felt tired to his bones, yet strangely alive with the knowledge of what he had endured. For the first time since discovering the nest, he believed he might actually be able to see this through. But nature was not finished testing him, and deep down, he knew it. When dawn finally broke after the brutal storm, the world emerged slowly as though reluctant to reveal what the night's violence had reshaped. The fields glistened under the faint early light, water pooling in every depression, running in thin, shimmering sheets across the furrows of the land. The air still held the metallic tang of lightning, the damp heaviness of sodden earth. Michael rose from where he had taken shelter under the small overhang of the barn, his clothes soaked through, his muscles stiff and sore from the hours he had spent battling the storm to keep the fragile nest intact. His boots squelched with every step as he crossed the yard, making his way back toward the potato rows with a kind of hollow dread. He had not slept, not truly. His mind had been too preoccupied with the thought of the tarp tearing, the trench failing, the cows escaping. Everything about the night had felt precarious, like balancing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. When he reached the structure he had built around the nest, he approached it with the caution of someone preparing himself for the worst. The tarp sagged in the center, weighed down by the weight of accumulated rainwater, but it had not collapsed. The stakes held, the ropes held. The trench still guided the runoff safely away. Relief washed through him like a sudden breath of air after being underwater too long. But even as he felt this small victory, a sense of unease settled over him again. It wasn't over. He knew it wasn't over. Nature didn't test a man once. It tested him repeatedly, relentlessly, until it had stripped away everything unnecessary and left only what mattered most. He knelt beside the tarp and pressed the soil lightly with his palm. It was cool and soft, but no longer saturated. The rain had eased enough for the ground to begin absorbing the excess water. He adjusted the tarp carefully, letting a stream of water spill harmlessly onto the trench, then lifted one edge just enough to peer underneath. The eggs were still there, 6 pale ovals resting undisturbed in their shallow hollow. But something about them was different. He squinted, leaning closer. There were faint lines on the shells, thin, delicate cracks spidering across the surfaces like the gentle veins of a leaf. For a moment he did not move, unsure if the cracks meant damage from the storm or something else entirely. Then understanding struck him with a sudden clarity. The eggs were beginning to hatch. He swallowed hard and lowered the tarp gently, careful not to disturb the nest. A wave of emotion overcame him. Relief, awe, fear, pride, all tangled together into something he didn't have a name for. After days of anxiety, weeks of protecting a secret that could ruin him if anyone found out, the fragile life inside those shells was finally emerging. But it could not be happening at a worse time. The storm had left everything vulnerable, and as if summoned by the thought, a faint sound carried across the field, the steady rhythmic thumping of hooves. He turned sharply and scanned the horizon. At first he saw nothing, just the early morning haze drifting across the pasture. Then they appeared, several of Douglas's cows wandering along the edge of the fence, their movements sluggish, unpredictable after the storm. The weakened fence on the far side, already barely held together, now sagged under the weight of the previous night's winds. It wouldn't take much for one of the cows to push through, just a gentle nudge or a bump of curiosity. And if they wandered into the rows, if they stepped too near the nest, it would all be over. One misplaced hoof could crush the eggs or the newly hatched turtles in an instant. Michael broke into a run, his boots splashed through puddles, mud slapping against his jeans as he reached the fence line. He waved his arms and shouted to drive the animals back. They lifted their heads lazily, blinking their large, placid eyes as though the world had not just endured a night of chaos. One of them stepped forward, nudging the weakened plank with its nose. The wood creaked. Michael's heart jammed into his throat. He grabbed a fallen branch from the ground and waved it, stepping between the cows and the fence, shouting again until they reluctantly backed away. But he knew they wouldn't stay away for long, not in this weakened state of the fence, not with the scent of soft earth drawing them in. He jogged back toward the barn to gather more boards and nails, but before he got far, another sound caught his attention, one he had not heard in weeks but instantly recognized. A loud honking chorus in the distance grew steadily louder as a flock of geese descended toward the fields. Not the harmless kind, but the aggressive, opportunistic geese from a nearby commercial farm. Birds smart enough to sense newly hatched prey. Geese that would not hesitate to snatch up anything small and vulnerable. He could already see them circling overhead, their sharp eyes scanning the landscape in search of an easy meal. Panic surged through him. He sprinted back to the nest, his pulse hammering in his ears. The eggs were no longer just cracked, they were hatching. Tiny limbs pushed against the shells, creating moments of movement, subtle but undeniable. The small, dark eyes of a baby tortoise appeared through one of the cracks, blinking slowly as if awakening into an unfriendly world. Another egg shifted. Another crack widened. They were coming, and the world was coming for them. Michael threw himself into action. He grabbed the mesh rolls he kept near the barn leftovers from a project he had abandoned and raced back to the nest. He unrolled the mesh, creating a makeshift tunnel leading from the nest toward the tree line, where the thick underbrush would offer cover. He dug quickly with his hands to shape the path, smoothing the mud into a gentle incline so the newborn turtles would not struggle climbing out of the hollow. He anchored the mesh with stones and branches, creating a narrow corridor fenced off from the open field. But even as he built it, he knew it wasn't enough. The geese overhead were circling lower. Their shadows glided across the field in long, ominous strokes. He heard the cows again, shifting, restless, inching toward the weakened fence. And as if the world had decided to tighten the vise even further, the distant rumble of pickup trucks reached his ears. He turned instinctively and saw 2 county wildlife enforcement vehicles crawling down the long dirt road toward the properties, dust rising behind their tires. His breath caught. Of all the days, of all the moments, if the inspectors reached his field now, if they saw what he had spent weeks hiding, it would be the end of everything. He would lose his farm. He would lose control of his land. He would be fined, restricted, monitored, all because he had done the right thing. He moved faster, adrenaline pushing his exhausted muscles beyond their limit. He ripped branches from a fallen limb and thrust them into the mesh corridor, creating a leafy canopy overhead. He dragged more pieces of tarp and draped them over the structure to blend it into the dirt. He pushed mud over the edges with frantic precision until the tunnel looked like part of the landscape, messy, natural, unremarkable. The inspector's trucks grew closer. The geese swooped lower. A tortoise broke fully through its shell, tiny limbs trembling. Michael forced himself to breathe. He positioned himself between the inspectors and the nest, blocking their line of sight as he waved casually, too casually. He shouted a greeting, trying to make his voice sound steady, normal. Anything but the adrenaline-soaked panic thundering inside him. The inspectors slowed but did not pull in. They paused at the end of the road, consulting papers on their dashboard, then continued onward toward the next property. They weren't here for him. He nearly collapsed with relief, but he didn't have time to rest. Not while another egg cracked open. Not while the geese honked angrily overhead. Not while the cows shifted closer again with heavy impatience. He knelt beside the nest, guiding the first baby tortoise gently toward the entrance of the tunnel with the softest touch of a small branch, making sure not to touch it directly. The creature moved slowly, unsure, but it moved. Another followed, then another. He guarded them fiercely, waving his arms at the geese whenever they drew too near, shouting at the cows when they wandered toward the weak fence again. Every second felt like fighting off a different enemy, whether animals, people, as if the entire world had conspired to test his resolve. One by one, the tiny turtles made their way into the narrow corridor, disappearing into the green shadows that awaited them at the end. The moment the last one slipped beneath the mesh canopy, Michael let out a long breath he did not realize he had been holding. He stood there for a long moment, shoulders slumped, soaked in sweat and mud, the air thick with the aftermath of the storm and the chaos of survival. The geese finally drifted away. The cows settled. The inspectors' trucks were long gone. For the first time all day, silence fell over the field. He felt it wash over him slowly, not triumphant, not jubilant, but something deeper, something steady, something earned. He had done what he never thought himself capable of doing. He had protected something fragile in a world determined to crush it, and he wasn't finished yet. The turtles had reached safety, but morning had only begun. The consequences, the risks, and the weight of keeping the secret were still waiting beyond the horizon. But for now, he allowed himself to breathe. When the last of the tiny turtles disappeared beneath the shadowed underbrush, Michael remained kneeling in the mud as though the earth itself had finally loosened its grip on his spine. The storm clouds had long since drifted away toward the horizon, leaving the sky washed pale and quiet, the air still heavy with the scent of rain-soaked soil. His arms trembled from exhaustion, his knees ached from crouching, and his clothes hung damp and cold against his skin. Yet in that first breath after the final hatchling vanished into the wild, he felt a fragile peace settle over him, a slow, steady warmth that came not from the sun, but from the profound relief of knowing he had done what he was meant to do. He stayed there for several long minutes, listening to the faint rustle of leaves where the hatchlings had gone, half expecting some threat to come sweeping back over the field. But the world was still now. Even the geese had retreated, fading into distant specks against the sky, their cries no longer sharp and predatory, but softened by distance. The cows stood lazily in the pasture with no intention of crossing the fence again. The inspector's trucks were gone, swallowed by the long dirt road. For the first time in many days, nothing was coming for the nest he had guarded. Slowly, he rose to his feet, wiping his hands on his mud-streaked jeans. The improvised shelter he had constructed, its tarp sagging under the weight of the night's rain, the stakes leaning slightly, the trench filled nearly to the brim, looked like a battlefield that had just barely survived the final assault. It no longer served a purpose. The nest was empty now. What remained was only a memory in the soil, a small hollow that would soon be reclaimed by the wind, the rain, and the steady march of nature. He stepped inside the enclosure and gathered the stones he had used to brace the mesh tunnel, stacking them off to the side. He pulled up the wooden stakes one by one, each groaning softly as they released their hold on the earth. The tarp came last. He lifted it carefully, shaking loose the water trapped on top, and folded it into a damp bundle under his arm. As he worked, the field slowly returned to its original rhythm. The soft hum of insects resumed their morning activity, a faint chatter in the tall grass along the fence. Birds flitted between the branches of the old pecan trees, their wings flashing in the new light. The air felt reborn, as though the storm had not only cleansed the land, but had granted it a brief, gentle pause before the relentless heat of the day returned. Michael found himself moving more slowly now, not with the frantic urgency that had driven him during the storm, but with the careful, reflective motions of someone concluding a chapter of their life. He smoothed the soil around the nest, covering the imprint of each egg until the ground looked nearly indistinguishable from the rest of the field. There was something almost ceremonial in the way he shaped the earth with his hands, as though he were tucking away a secret into the land itself. When he finished, he stood a few feet away, gazing at the spot where the nest had been. It seemed impossible that something so small, so silent, could have consumed his thoughts so entirely. And yet, as he stood there, the memory of the first egg he had uncovered returned to him vividly. The shock of seeing the pale curve beneath the soil, the slow understanding, the fear of what it meant, and the weight of responsibility that had settled on him like a mantle he had no choice but to wear. Now the clutch was gone, and with it the fragile beings he had protected with a fierce, almost instinctive devotion. He wondered where they would go next, if they would survive the predators and the unpredictable forces of nature awaiting them. There was no way to know. Nature offered no guarantees, but he had given them a chance, and sometimes that was the most a man could do. As he walked away from the field, the morning sun slid across the land in long golden streaks, glinting off the puddles scattered across the earth. His boots left prints in the soft mud that would fade by evening. He carried the folded tarp and the mesh under one arm, making his way back toward the barn. His steps grew slower as he approached the familiar structure, the weight of exhaustion settling more deeply into his limbs. He placed the materials back where he had found them, stacking the boards neatly in the corner and hanging the rope back on its hook. He rinsed the mud from his hands and arms using the old outdoor tap, watching the cloudy brown water swirl down into the gravel below. For a few moments he simply stood there, leaning against the barn wall, his breath rising and falling in steady, measured waves. The stillness of the morning pressed in on him, not oppressive, but comforting in a way he had not expected after such a chaotic night. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the warmth of the sun rest on his face. A strange but welcome sense of accomplishment settled deep inside him. Not pride in the boastful sense. There was no one here to witness what he had done, no applause to earn. It was something quieter, something rooted in the land and in the values handed down through generations of his family. Protect what is fragile, tend to what is entrusted to you, and do what is right even when no one sees. Eventually, he pushed off the barn wall and made his way back to the house. His body felt heavy with fatigue, but his mind had softened into a clarity he hadn't felt in days. When he stepped inside, the kitchen greeted him with familiar warmth, the faint scent of coffee lingering from his hurried morning hours before. He filled a mug, took a seat at the kitchen table, and stared out the window toward the fields. From here, the area looked ordinary again, as though nothing unusual had taken place. Just another patch of farmland among miles of rolling fields. But he knew better. The truth was buried there, not in a physical sense anymore, but in the quiet understanding that he had witnessed something rare, something delicate and fleeting, and had been tested in a way he would never forget. He took a slow sip of his coffee, feeling its warmth spread through him. The lingering anxiety that had gripped him so tightly in recent days felt like it was finally loosening its hold. He knew that Douglas would eventually grow bored of his suspicions. Men like him always did when they failed to uncover excitement quickly enough, and the inspectors had only been passing by. They would have no reason to return here. The farm would return to its usual rhythm soon enough. Life had a way of doing that, slipping back into routine even after moments of crisis. As the morning stretched into midday, he walked the property again, checking the fence line, inspecting the fields, and clearing debris left by the storm. He felt a renewed connection to the land with each step. It was no longer just soil beneath his boots. It was a quiet universe of lives and stories unfolding in ways he would never fully understand. And yet, he played a part in it. Not a controlling hand, but a guiding one. A protector where needed, an observer everywhere else. Before the sun reached its peak, he found himself drawn toward the small pond on the far side of his property. It wasn't large and it wasn't deep, but it had always been a serene place, a patch of calm water surrounded by reeds and wildflowers, a haven for frogs and dragonflies. As he approached the water's edge, he paused, hands resting lightly on his hips, eyes scanning the gentle ripple across the surface. There was no sign of the hatchlings, of course. They would be somewhere in the thick brush now, hidden beneath leaves or burrowed into the soft earth. But the pond felt different now, as though it held a quiet promise. He imagined, just for a moment, one of the young tortoises finding its way here someday, taking its first sip of this cool water, beginning a life that would stretch beyond anything he would ever see. He smiled, a small, private smile that belonged to no one else. Eventually, he walked back to the house, the long shadows of the trees stretching across the yard. He spent the rest of the day tending to his chores, mending tools, sweeping the porch, feeding the animals. Normal tasks, familiar motions. But even as he returned to his routines, a part of him remained near the field where the nest had once been, near the place where he had knelt in the mud and rain to protect something that couldn't protect itself. When evening settled over the farm and the sky turned a soft amber, he stood once more on the porch, looking out over the land that had shaped him. The fields glowed faintly in the fading light, the air warm and still. He knew that tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more days just like the thousands before it. But each year, each season, each sudden discovery in the soil reminded him that the land held more stories than he would ever uncover. He lifted his gaze toward the horizon. The world felt vast again, and deep inside, in a place he rarely let himself acknowledge, he hoped that next spring, when the earth warmed and the winds carried the scent of new life, he might find another small hollow in the soil, another chance to watch something fragile emerge and take its first uncertain steps into the world. Another reminder that even in the quietest corners of a farm, extraordinary things could happen, and he would be ready. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with your friends. And make sure to check out our next episodes and other stories. You definitely won't want to miss what's coming next.